Welcome to Shoot for the Moon, the Space Race, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. Let's begin by reviewing the basics of the Cold War. World War II was finally over, but a new struggle was just beginning. After the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two most powerful nations left standing. However, these former allies now became enemies. These two superpowers differed on issues of human rights, individual liberties, economic philosophies, and religious freedom. The United States, as a capitalist democracy, was and still is a nation of free ideas and free trade. However, the Soviet Union was a communist nation where ideally all people should be equal and have the same access to material goods. In reality, communist nations like the Soviet Union were dictatorships, where citizens were often poor and lacked basic rights. The Soviet Union wanted to spread a communist revolution across the world, but the U.S. was determined to oppose this. Thus, after the end of World War II, a Cold War began that would last over 40 years. This was called a Cold War because the two sides never fought each other directly. Each side began to build up its military forces and arms, or weapons, to intimidate the other side. The U.S. and Soviet Union began to arm themselves for the possibility of a larger war. Some referred to this feared future war as World War III. Both sides began to build up large arsenals of weapons that would be much more destructive than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan during World War II. As part of this nuclear arms race, the Soviets began to develop a national rocket and missile program. In the spring of 1956, Communist Party Chairman Nikita Khrushchev warned that Soviet rockets carrying thermonuclear warheads would soon be able to hit any target on Earth. Because both sides possessed nuclear weapons and were prepared to use them, an actual war between them wasn't an option. It might have resulted in the end of human civilization. The U.S. and Soviet Union never actually went to war, directly at least. What they did do was square off in a series of smaller proxy wars involving other nations. A proxy is someone else who acts on your behalf. These proxy wars, like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, allow the two enemies to oppose each other while never using nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, tensions between the two superpowers grew to a new level and into a new arena on October 4, 1957. On this date, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Sputnik was a communications satellite, and it was the first object to be placed into Earth's orbit by people. It was about the size of a beach ball and weighed approximately 184 pounds. It took 98 minutes for Sputnik to orbit the Earth. What you are about to hear is the steady beep of Sputnik. Sputnik orbited the Earth and transmitted radio signals for 21 days before burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. The launch of Sputnik started the space race and the beginning of the space age, an era of new military, technological, and scientific developments. The space race was a competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to explore space using artificial satellites, space probes, and human-piloted spacecraft. It also included the goal of becoming the first nation to land an astronaut on the moon. The space race served as a way for each side to demonstrate the superiority of its science and technology. Although the space race spanned a number of administrations in both countries, it is most associated with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and U.S. President John F. Kennedy. The launch of Sputnik was a big surprise for Americans, and not a pleasant one. NBC News reported that it was the most important story of the century. The U.S. did not want to fall behind in technological achievements to the Soviets, nor did it want to surrender the new frontier of space to its enemy. Further, because Sputnik was launched into orbit via a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile, many feared that the Soviets were now so advanced in rocketry that they could now hit U.S. cities with armed missiles. Fears of nuclear war escalated. Just 1 month after the launch of Sputnik, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, which carried the first space traveler, a dog named Laika. The American public quickly became engulfed in what some would call Sputnik mania. Just a few months later, in January 1958, the United States launched its first satellite into orbit, and it also carried science instruments aboard. The satellite was called Explorer 1. Later that same year, in July 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was created by President Eisenhower. NASA became the primary federal agency responsible for aerospace research and the civilian space program. One of NASA's earliest objectives was to launch a crewed vehicle into Earth's orbit before the Soviets. Then, in September 1958, the enactment of the National Defense Education Act, or NDEA, authorized massive federal funding to enhance education and research in math, science, and modern languages. This funding was viewed as a way to align educational programs with national defense needs and as a way for America to be better equipped to compete with the Soviets in science and technology. To compete with the Soviets in the race for space, NASA started Project Mercury. It was the United States' first human spaceflight program. It started in 1958 and was completed in 1963. The program had three specific objectives: to orbit a crewed spacecraft around the Earth, to investigate an astronaut's ability to function in space, and to recover both astronaut and spacecraft safely. Project Mercury completed 6 crewed missions, and through the accomplishment of its objectives, NASA learned a great deal about human capabilities in the environment of outer space. Before we take a look at 2 of Project Mercury's crewed missions, you might be wondering how a person became one of America's first astronauts. Well, NASA asked the U.S. military to create a list of members who met certain qualifications. In looking for its first astronauts, NASA required that prospective astronauts be younger than 40 years old and in excellent physical condition. They also had to be less than 5 feet 11 inches tall in order to fit into the small space capsule. Prospective astronauts must have earned a bachelor's degree in engineering, be a qualified jet pilot, have graduated from test pilot school, and have acquired at least 1,500 hours of flying time. Once the initial candidates were put forward, which consisted of just over 100 men, the selection process began. Candidates were interviewed extensively, and their military and medical records were thoroughly examined. They were put through a series of extraordinary tests, including psychological, technical, and physical tests. 7 men were chosen to be the first human voyagers into space, the first astronauts. The 7 men chosen were Marine Corps aviator John Glenn, naval aviators Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Scott Carpenter, and Air Force pilots Deke Slayton, Gus Grissom, and Gordon Cooper. These astronauts were collectively known as the Mercury 7, or the original 7. You might find it interesting to know that the Mercury program was named after the Roman god Mercury, who was known for his speed. Each astronaut in the Mercury program named his single-person spacecraft, and each included the number 7 to represent the teamwork of the 7 astronauts. One of NASA's earliest objectives through Project Mercury was to launch an astronaut into Earth's orbit before the Soviets. However, this milestone in the race for space was won by the Soviets. In April 1961, the Soviets launched a spherical capsule-like spacecraft named Vostok 1 into space. It carried cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, and he became the first human in space and the first person to orbit the Earth. He orbited the Earth for 108 minutes. After his successful flight, Gagarin remarked, "When I orbited the Earth in a spaceship, I saw for the first time how beautiful our planet is. Mankind, let us preserve and increase this beauty and not destroy it." Less than a month later, Project Mercury launched its first crewed flight. On May 5, 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard climbed aboard his Mercury spacecraft, which he had named Freedom 7, and blasted off into space.
All right, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
With this successful launch, Shepard became the first American in space, though not into orbit. Aboard Freedom 7, Shepard piloted a 15-minute suborbital flight. During this flight, Shepard took manual control of the spacecraft to test its controls and also made observations of conditions outside of the capsule. The flight also tested Shepard's ability to withstand the high G-forces of launch and re-entry. During the flight, Shepard reported seeing the outlines of the west coast of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, as well as Florida's Lake Okeechobee. Shepard became the first person to return to Earth with his spacecraft because the Mercury spacecraft had parachutes to slow the craft for a water landing. Both the astronaut and space capsule could then be recovered by helicopter. Freedom 7 parachuted into the sea roughly 300 miles from the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Emerging safely from his capsule after the water landing, Shepard exclaimed, "Man, what a ride!" Despite the success of Freedom 7, the U.S. was anxious to get an astronaut to orbit the Earth, like the Soviets had already done. In February 1962, aboard a Mercury spacecraft named Friendship 7, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. The launch went flawlessly.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
However, at the end of his first orbit of the Earth, the automatic control system failed. Glenn went into manual control and conducted 2 more orbits of the Earth. A sensor warning also signaled there might be an issue with the spacecraft's heat shield. It was feared that Glenn and his spacecraft could be incinerated on re-entry. Glenn's mission was cut short, but he successfully re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, and he and his space capsule were safely recovered. After inspecting his recovered capsule, NASA officials determined that the sensor had just malfunctioned. With Glenn's successful orbits of the Earth, America proved it was a serious contender in the race for space with the Soviets. After his Mercury mission, John Glenn became a national hero. He would go on to represent the state of Ohio as a U.S. Senator for 4 consecutive terms. At the age of 77, he would return to space on the Space Shuttle Discovery for a 9-day mission. With this mission, he became the oldest human to venture into space. Later, Glenn remarked, "I still find it hard to believe how far we have come from the time I first flew on Friendship 7 and the Discovery flight. I go from being crammed into a capsule the size of a telephone booth to a place where I could live and work in space. Amazing." On May 25, 1961, before a special joint session of Congress, President John F. Kennedy announced an ambitious goal.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
At this point on the American side of the space race, Project Mercury's biggest milestone was Alan Shepard's 15-minute suborbital flight, which took place 20 days before Kennedy's speech. Kennedy's goal was definitely an ambitious one. On September 12, 1962, while Project Mercury was still underway, President Kennedy spoke to students at Rice University in Texas about America's progress in space technology. President Kennedy identified Houston, Texas as the new headquarters for NASA and promised that the United States would land an astronaut on the moon before the next decade. Let's listen to an excerpt from Kennedy's speech at Rice University.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Project Mercury established that America could place an astronaut in orbit, and that the astronaut could survive in space and return successfully. This program paved the way for Project Gemini. Project Gemini would become known as the Bridge to the Moon. The Gemini program helped NASA get ready for the moon landings, which would be conducted as part of the Apollo program, the program that would follow Project Gemini. Project Gemini had a number of objectives. NASA needed to learn what happened when astronauts spent many days in space. As part of Gemini, NASA would conduct extended missions that went as long as 2 weeks. NASA needed to learn how astronauts could go outside a spacecraft in a spacesuit. As part of Gemini, astronauts would conduct spacewalks in zero gravity. NASA needed to learn how to connect 2 spacecrafts together in space. Going to the moon would require all of these things. As part of Gemini, astronauts would practice maneuvering spacecraft by means of manual control and would practice rendezvousing and docking in space. Gemini astronauts would also work on perfecting re-entry and landing methods. The word Gemini means twins in Latin, and the Gemini program would allow 2 astronauts to travel together in a newly designed 2-person space capsule. The Gemini spacecraft were designed to be able to change their own orbit. This would allow them to carry out rendezvous and docking procedures with a target vehicle in Earth's orbit. The Gemini capsule was launched atop a Titan II rocket. NASA's Gemini program was made up of some of the veterans of the Mercury program, including Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, and Gordon Cooper, as well as some new recruits. Deke Slayton, who was selected as part of the Mercury 7 but had been grounded for a heart condition, helped select the crews for Gemini. Some of the Gemini astronauts would go on to become famous through their later work on the Apollo program, astronauts like Jim Lovell and Neil Armstrong. Project Gemini was a great success, and the astronauts accomplished many things on the 10 crewed missions that were conducted between 1965 and 1966. Gemini 3 was the first human-piloted flight of the Gemini program, and it took place in March 1965. It allowed the astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young to test the new Gemini spacecraft. During this mission, a space capsule changed its orbit in mid-flight for the first time. The Gemini 4 mission launched in June 1965 with astronauts Ed White and Jim McDivitt. Gemini 4 orbited the Earth for 4 days, which almost doubled NASA astronauts' previous time in space. This mission also included the first U.S. spacewalk, which was conducted by Ed White. This spacewalk, which was officially known as an extravehicular activity, or EVA, was not originally planned as part of the Gemini 4 mission. However, when Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to carry out a spacewalk in March 1965, the U.S. was determined to try to catch up with the Soviets. While attached to a 25-foot umbilical line and tether that provided oxygen and communications from the spacecraft, White spent roughly 20 minutes performing experiments that tested his ability to maneuver and function in space.
Okay, I'm coming over.
Okay, stand by.
You see me yet?
I sure don't.
Huh?
Oh, there you are. I'll put the camera on now. Okay. This is you're right in front, Ed. You look beautiful.
I feel like $1 million. I will pick up.
Upon conclusion of America's first spacewalk, White reported, "I'm coming back in, and it's the saddest moment of my life." What White learned from America's first spacewalk, and what other Gemini astronauts would learn from theirs, would help build the knowledge and skills for future Apollo astronauts to walk on the moon. In December 1965, Gemini 7 launched, and it stayed in space for roughly 2 weeks. Astronauts Jim Lovell and Frank Borman flew this mission. Their mission resulted in a new space endurance record of 13 days and 19 hours. The Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 spacecraft were in space at the same time and met each other in orbit. They achieved the first orbital rendezvous of 2 human-piloted spacecraft. The 2 spacecraft circled each other for 3 orbits, or about 5 hours. At least once, they came nose to nose, a short distance apart.
Right now, 6 is about 10 feet above and to the left of 7. We're just flying nose to nose, approximately 15 feet apart.
In March 1966, the Gemini 8 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott connected, or docked, with another spacecraft in orbit for the first time. A radio-controlled target vehicle, called the Agena, was sent into orbit first, and the Gemini 8 was launched. After Gemini 8 caught up to the Agena, it had to slide its nose into a docking collar on the Agena's nose, while the two traveled at a speed of 18,000 miles per hour. Docking was successful.
Flight, we are down. And he's really a smoothie.
Oh, Roger. Hey, congratulations. This is real good.
Okay, just for your information, the Agena was very stable, and at the present time we're having no noticeable oscillations at all.
Roger. Copy, Agena very stable and no noticeable oscillations. Very good.
However, not long after docking, a serious problem occurred.
Gemini 8, CSQ Capcom, contact, how do you read?
We got serious problems here with the forward coupling end over end, but we're disengaged from the Agena.
Okay, we got you a spacecraft 3 indication here.
Say again?
We're showing you spacecraft 3. What seems to be the problem?
They're rolling up and we can't turn anything off. Signaling increasing in a left roll.
A thruster malfunctioned and started firing out of control, which caused the still-connected crafts to spin wildly. Armstrong was able to separate or undock the two crafts, but Gemini 8 then started to spin even faster. The astronauts' vision began to blur, and they started to lose consciousness. Armstrong made a number of quick decisions and was able to stop the spinning, but to do so, he used up much of the fuel they needed to get out of orbit and safely back through the atmosphere. Gemini 8 had to end its mission early, and Armstrong ended up performing an emergency landing. It went off without a hitch. It had been Armstrong and Scott's first trip into space, and a memorable one at that. Kennedy Space Center Director Kurt Debus said that astronauts Armstrong and Scott achieved a completely successful re-entry gives the nation cause for rejoicing in their heroism and skill. Project Gemini accomplished many goals through its 10 human-piloted missions during 1965 and 1966. NASA learned what happened when astronauts spent many days in space. Its longest mission lasted 2 weeks. It learned how astronauts could go outside a spacecraft in a spacesuit and maneuver in space. It learned how to connect two spacecraft together in space. Going to the moon would require astronauts to do all of these things, and Project Gemini proved it could be done.